Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into the work of Gayle Rubin, a feminist anthropologist who completely changed the conversation around sex. She asked a really radical question. What if our rules about sex aren't really about morality at all, but about power? I mean, think about it. Why are societies all over the world so obsessed with policing sexuality? We're often taught that these rules are just natural or that they're for our own good. But Rubin suggested we look deeper. What if there's a different story to tell?
And this is where Gayle Rubin enters the picture. Back in the 70s and 80s, feminism was already making huge waves. But Rubin looked at the landscape and said, hang on, we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle here. So let's get into what she uncovered.
Okay, so to really get what Rubin did, we have to understand the world she was in. At the time, feminist theory was laser-focused on one main idea: gender oppression. And look, that was an absolutely critical framework, but Rubin started to notice it had some serious blind spots.
In fact, early in her career, Rubin herself helped build that framework. She came up with this idea of the sex-gender system. The whole point was to show how society takes the raw material of biological sex and shapes it, molds it into a social product, creating our gender roles, our identities, everything. It was a foundational concept.
And this theory was, without a doubt, a game changer for understanding the oppression of women. But Rubin realized it had limits. It couldn't really explain why people were persecuted for their desires, for who or how they loved. The lens they were using was just too narrow. They needed a new one. And that brings us to her bombshell 1984 essay, Thinking Sex. This is where she makes a really sharp distinction, one that would completely reshape how we talk about these things for decades.
Rubin basically said, look, gender and sexuality are two different things. They're related for sure, they often overlap, but they are distinct systems of oppression. So for example, a lesbian faces prejudice for being a woman, right? That's gender oppression. But she also faces prejudice for her sexual orientation. A single theory about gender just can't explain both of those things at the same time.
So if the old way of thinking was incomplete, what was her solution? Well, Rubin proposed a whole new theory of sex itself. She argued that we need to stop thinking of sexuality as just a side effect of gender and start seeing it for what it is, its own unique political battleground.
And this, right here, is the heart of it. Sexuality isn't some private, personal thing that just happens behind closed doors. Oh no. It is organized by our society. It is regulated by our laws and institutions. It's a place of intense political struggle over who gets to be seen as normal, what's considered acceptable, or even who's considered fully human. And she showed that this stuff isn't timeless. Our modern sexual world didn't just pop into existence. Big historical changes like industrialization, people moving from farms to big cities, all of that created the conditions for new identities and new communities to form around shared desires. And you've got to remember, the goal here wasn't just to write a clever academic paper. For Rubin, this was deeply political. The whole point was to create a tool, a weapon even, that could be used to identify, explain, and ultimately fight back against all forms of erotic injustice.
But to even begin building this new theory, she had to clear the ground first. She had to take on these really powerful, deeply ingrained ideas that actually stop us from thinking clearly about sex in the first place.
Rubin argued that our thinking gets blocked by three main forces, what she called sexual essentialism, sexual negativity, and the big one, the sexual hierarchy. So let's break these down one by one. First up is sexual essentialism. This is basically the idea that sex is just a natural biological force, something timeless and unchanging. Rubin says this is a trap. Because if we believe sex is just natural, then we become blind to the ways it's actually shaped by politics, by history, and by power. The second obstacle is sexual negativity. This is that deep-seated cultural belief that sex is, at its core, dangerous and destructive. It's a worldview that treats basically any sexual act as guilty until proven innocent, and it's used to justify all kinds of control and regulation. And that brings us to the third and maybe the most powerful obstacle she identified. It's this invisible system that society uses to sort all sexual acts into a rigid pecking order of value. Rubin calls this the sexual hierarchy. You can picture it like a pyramid. Right at the very top, you've got the good, normal stuff, married, monogamous, heterosexual sex. Then below that, you have acts that are maybe questionable, kind of tolerated, but not really celebrated. And then way down at the bottom, you have the acts that society considers totally bad, unnatural, and deserving of punishment.
So what's holding this whole thing together? It's the core belief that there's only one right way to be sexual. a single ideal standard. Every other kind of desire, every other practice, is then judged based on how far away it is from that privileged norm. And that, right there, is how you create a system of erotic injustice.
Now, this essay was written decades ago, but what's incredible is how relevant it still is. Rubin's framework is an essential tool for understanding the battles over sexuality that are happening all around us, right now.
When you boil it all down, Gayle Rubin's work was a massive paradigm shift. She gave us the language and the concepts to stop seeing sexuality as some simple biological fact and to start seeing it for what it truly is, a complex social and political system constantly being shaped by history, power, and the ongoing fight for justice.
And that really leaves us with a final question to think about. Using Rubin's ideas as a lens, just look at the world around you. What's considered good sex today? What's just barely tolerated? And what is still punished? The hierarchies are still there if you know